Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on creating resilience offshore. My name is Ben Pollard and I will be looking after the technical aspect of this webinar today. You will notice the chat box in the top right corner of your screen. Should you have any technical issues during this webinar, you can ask any questions and I will respond directly back to you. Please can I ask that you refrain from sending messages in the chat box unless they're to do with issues you are having. I only say this as the chat box can get quite busy otherwise. Your speaker today is Dr Jenny Lunt, who is an occupational health psychologist and managing director of Lunt Associates Ltd. She is here today to deliver this session in order to improve your know-how on boosting workforce resilience within the offshore sector. We also have with us Simon Hatson from the Offshore Group Committee, who has helped to put this session together today. He will be on hand to review any questions that come in during the session and help with the Q&A after the presentation. So before I pass you over to Jenny, just a final point for the session. As I mentioned about Q&A, you will notice a separate Q&A box in the bottom right corner of your screen. If you have any questions for Jenny during the session, please ask your questions in this box. At the end of the presentation, Simon will go through any of these with Jenny and answer any questions you have submitted. Should we run out of time and be unable to tackle all of the questions, we will aim to provide written answers if possible that can be emailed out after the webinar, should we be able to. I shall now pass you over to Jenny and hope you all enjoy the session.
Hello everyone, this is Jenny Lunt speaking. A warm welcome to you all. As Ben has just introduced, I'm a psychologist and I've a number of years working in health and safety. Most of that time was working in the health and safety laboratory as a principal psychologist, and I specialised in the areas of behaviour change and wellbeing at work. More recently I've gone freelancing, and I should also say as well I'm an associate for a company called Tribe, formerly JOMC, and Hill Solomon, who specialise in culture change as well. Now, what I want to do with this presentation is to unpack the role in resilience in the offshore sector. And the reason why it's important is because, as with other sectors, the offshore sector has undergone increasing uncertainty, economic uncertainty in recent years, for example, with the price of oil fluctuating and dropping over time, which has meant that, for example, led to more kind of lean management decisions and more kind of cutbacks. And that in common with lots of other industries in the public and private sector, I should say, has meant that people are doing more for less. And what makes this particularly pertinent for the offshore sector is there's particular factors that makes it even more important to look after the resilience of workforce, such as the isolated nature of the working. And the fact that the job is very safety critical. It's a very safety critical industry, coupled with factors such as the weather and the interactions between that and the safety hazards, which makes it absolutely essential that the resilience of the workforce is looked after so that they can stay safe and so that their performance, that they can persist in the event of more unrelenting demands. So if we go on to the next slide, which is about the objectives, this is the kind of areas that I want to cover. Is firstly, I will unpack in the first instance what resilience means. Now, the emphasis of this is, if you know anything about the topic of resilience, you'll be aware there's a distinction between organisational resilience, individual resilience, and team resilience. My emphasis is going to be on what the organisation needs to do to look after the resilience of the individuals and the teams that make it up. So the kind of conditions they need to provide. So I should also emphasise as well is that this isn't about overhauling current approaches. These ideas are meant to be practical. They're meant to supplement current approaches. So this isn't so. You'll be using approaches very much based on the risk management tradition. As I said, this is to supplement those standard ways of working. So the first part is unpacking what resilience means and how it sits in relation to the kind of more standard conventional approaches. think a bit more about what the offshore stresses are, thinking about resilience should help with. Look at more specifically at some of the strategies for dealing with resilience offshore, and then highlight the benefits, and in particular the relationship between resilience and safety via situational awareness and areas such as high reliability organisations. So, starting with the first objective. In order to understand what resilience means, it's often seen as a kind of antidote to stress. So to understand it, we must first be clear on what stress means. And of course, many people have an idea of what it is because they experience it day in, day out. But it's just important to highlight and to recognise that the conventional or accepted definitions of stress that tends to be used by HSE, for example, is that we experience stress as a response. When we appraise, i.e. we adjudge a situation, the demands of the situations, to exceed our coping resources, our ability to deal with it. And therefore, the fact that there's the appraisal element involved, the judgment element involved, means that it's very much a subjective experience. How people manifest stress varies very much from one person to another, but what's important to realise is that when people do feel stressed, there's often a change in their behaviour, and we'll come on to how it's important to be able to kind of notice those kind of signals so that you can respond to them more quickly. But key to this is as a reminder that stress is subjective, and that's due to the appraisal factor. And that threshold point at which we can judge the context to exceed, or the demands placed in its context to exceed our ability to cope with it, that point's there for everyone. No one is immune to this. It's there for everyone. This is an entirely normal, everyone experiences it time to time, but it's when it's prolonged, it's unrelenting, it's when we need to do something about it so that people can stay effective and their well-being is preserved. So if we go on to the next slide, which is about, hopefully most of you will be familiar with the Yerkes-Dodson curve. It's been around for a long time now, but again, it's just a reminder of the relationship between stress and pressure. So if the demands that we experience or the workload they experience is not enough, if we become bored, then our performance is undermined. If the stress and demands that we experience become too much, then once again our performance is undermined. So the challenge is to make sure we're operating in the optimal range in the middle, whereby when this is about pressure. So the demands have increased, the expectations have increased, but we are able to step up to the challenge successfully, and that is where we get our optimal range of performance, and that's what we aim to need to achieve through both stress prevention and resilience management. So again, if we go on to the next slide, one of the most established ways for managing stress is via HSE's management standards for stress. And the premise for that is that good management should be good stress management. And the emphasis of this approach is on prevention. And it was intentionally based on the conventional risk management approach, i.e. the 5 steps for risk assessment, to make sure it readily assimilated into what organisations are already doing. And when HSE developed this, what they did is they developed some standards which are kind of distillations of a kind of evidence of what the key sources of stress, i.e. stressors that more or less affect everyone and cuts across all industries. And you can see there in front of you what those key standards are. Now, I think it's just important to highlight that particularly toxic combinations to be mindful of is that, for example, the interactions between demands and control. So, for example, when we have high demands and low control, then it's much more likely we're going to experience stress. People who have high demands And high control, i.e. more senior people, are less likely, the evidence tells us, generally tends to tell us, that less likely to experience stress. The other important interaction to bear in mind is the effort-reward imbalance, which falls under support, i.e. where people feel they're putting more effort than what they're getting back, then that associates burnout. And again, that's something that needs to be important to address through stress prevention and resilience management. So one of the reasons, if we go on to the next slide now, one of the reasons why HSE launched and developed the management standards approach, and that occurred in 2004, was because up until that point, stress management was largely done on an individual reactive basis. And because it was increasingly recognised that stress was a leading cause of sickness absence coupled with MSDs at that time, and placing massive costs on society, HSE felt it was important to encourage organisations to take more responsibility for it by developing an intentionally organisational level preventative approach. So that was launched in 2004. And that was rolled out for a number of years, and it's rolled out, and similar approaches have been, for example, embedded in Europe and so on. Again, the emphasis on primary prevention at the organisational level because it tackles the root causes. Then in about 2008, the emphasis switched from stress to the more broader topic of well-being. And the reason for that was again there was a recognition that the sickness absence figures were not necessarily going down, and stress was still there as one of the leading causes. So it was broadened out to focus on well-being. So therefore, it was including kind of more positive approaches to health, which is looking at areas such as job satisfaction and health promotion as well, and using positive approaches in particular. It was also moving away purely from prevention to also thinking about, well, what kind of workplace needs to be created to accommodate people once they do start to struggle, and also linking that with return to work. So a really truly holistic approach. However, hot on the heels of this emphasis on well-being, of course, that we then had the recession. So more recently, the emphasis is switched back to prevention again, the prevention of harm. Recognizing, though, preventing demands in itself nowadays is not the total answer, because not all of those demands are avoidable. They cannot be totally mitigated. In which case, stress prevention at the organizational level needs to be supplemented with giving people the resources and providing them conditions in which they can persevere in the face of those unrelenting demands without fading out, without burning out, and so that they stay effective and stay switched on, and for this sector in particular, stay safe. So if again, what I have done with the subsequent slides, in this slide with about the children on the balloons, that emphasises what resilience is. It's the ability to persevere in the face of an unavoidable challenge. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to bounce back from some kind of adversity. I mean, you can learn a lot from doing it, and that will enable resilience, but resilience is more about just being able to sustain your ability to perform in the face of these unavoidable demands and unrelenting demands, using some very practical solutions and that also means maintaining the interpersonal skills and the kind of softer skills that is the first thing that can suffer, for example, for when people are under pressure and when lean management practices get adopted. So again, if we unpack this, what I have done with the next slide, the resilience, this is called this resilience star, is I've distilled the evidence about what it makes, what's required to become, create a resilience workforce into 6 principles. So on the one hand, you have a meaningful principle. And what that is about is trying to make sure that the workforce finds some kind of meaning from the work. And the evidence tells us that where, for example, in the public sector, research in the public sector, where people get some meaning from the work, and where it's fitting with the values, they're getting some kind of sense of accomplishment, it's achieving a meaningful purpose for them, that will help them persevere in the face of, for example, frozen pay salary, for example. That will allow them to persevere. So having meaningful work is a particularly important way of keeping resilient. Moving around the star, onto the agreeable principle. That is recognition about how comfortable the work environment is, the working context is, in terms of the psychosocial conditions as well as the physical conditions. Now, of course, in the offshore sector, you have weather and you have noise, for example, that cannot be totally eradicated, but it also mitigating those as far as possible is important. As far as possible, also alongside that as well, this is about making sure that people feel a sense of control over the demands they experience, and that the job is made as positive as possible through the small gestures, for example, through the recognition, through the feedback, that doesn't get lost, to look after the morale. Moving around the star again, the learning principle, and this is drawing on high reliability organisation evidence as well. As with safety, it's important for high safety critical organisations such as those that occupy work as in the offshore sector, that they are able to notice and use proactive processes for noticing the early warning signals of threats in the environment. So as with safety, those kind of same principles read across to health and well-being and resilience. It's important to be able to notice, measure and monitor the well-being of the workforce so that you can respond quickly in the event of the challenges they're affecting and they're under affecting their safety. So that's where safety and resilience reads across. Another aspect of resilience to bear in mind, and again, is the fitness principle, and I mean by this not just physical fitness, which of course is crucially important, and I know there can be challenges around that in the offshore sector, but it's also about thinking about people's energy overall, you know, the breaks, the patterns, the effect of fatigue, the recovery time that's allowed for following an intense period of working. The fifth principle to think about is the big picture principle, and that's all about taking perspective at the organisational level, team level and individual level, thinking ahead about the knock-on effects of decisions, for example, lean management decisions, on the pressure it might place on different aspects of a team. Because often when we're under pressure we think short term, and we need to be able to take time out very deliberately, sometimes building it into shift patterns to make sure we think about the knock-on effects very intentionally. This is also about being mindful at the organisational level of how joined up the decision-making communications is. So for example, if it's job cutbacks announced one day, and you find, for example, the next day there's been some kind of major refurbishment of some sort announced, that sends a signal that can jar, for example, with the morale of the people that remain. So it's really thinking about the subtleties of his message is important for keeping resilience going. And then finally we have the interdependent principle. So under that, of course, you have the quality of relationships and connections. And increasingly it's recognised that connections are an important buffer to stress, support. And that's not just quantity of support, it's quality. It's a kind of give and take in those relationships important. Is that knowing that when you can depend on people at one time and they can depend on you. You've got that kind of reciprocity built into those relationships. Online and on the crew, in the crew as well. So again, I know in the offshore, one of the major enablers of technology nowadays, it's much easier for crew to stay in touch with their family, which is vitally important, and that should never get lost. But it's looking at other more innovative ways to keep people connected in a positive way on the actual ship that's important. So now looking at specifically at more of the offshore stresses that typify the industry sector. Right, I know there's quite a lot on this slide, but what you'll see is I've tried to map some of the key stressors onto each of the kind of management standards as a way of kind of organising and understanding what they are. So, for example, if you look at the demands, and of course if you work in the sector you'll be very familiar with all this. But if you look at demands, you have the demands connected with the nature of the work. So, for example, on an oil rig, for some people, such as a roughnecks, it might be something to do with boredom. That's significant. They might not necessarily find their work the most inspiring, in which case that can be a demand too. Also for people involved, particularly in the drilling and in well control, that's a very cognitively demanding task that requires a heightened ongoing vigilance and being able to notice changes in the conditions of the well, for example, being able to respond to that using their kind of extensive experience interacting with a team. That requires heightened situational awareness, and that needs to be protected. And that demand, the evidence based on where the industry is going, is likely to increase, for example, with the expansion into deep water. In terms of other demands, up here you have client demands as well, and maybe that applies more to ships perhaps more than it does to oil rigs, but it's certainly, it's not to say it's not common to both, but client demands different expectations on the extent to which they apply pressure to get the job done, and that can vary. In terms of the nature of the work, shift patterns, the limited opportunity to switch off, especially when the weather is, the conditions are bad, the kind of dangerous work transfer going out on the helicopter, that means there's less opportunity for people to really rest, especially, for example, in the event of their shift, or they're staying out there for longer than, for example, 4 weeks due to the weather conditions. If it extends beyond that, that uncertainty coupled with fatigue can also interact, for example, with situational awareness and compound all the stresses they're experiencing. So also within that, of course, under control, you've got the job insecurity factor as well, which is kind of characterising the industry more and more, as with other industries as well. In terms of support, you have the things like isolation from home. As with any industry, there's going to be variation in the quality of line management. You've got on ships, you've got culturally diverse crew, so that can impose, for example, different attitudes towards safety, and language differences that need to be overcome. It can also be regarded as an opportunity for establishing some really kind of rewarding networks and connections as well. You have the contractors who might not necessarily feel they're part of the community on your rig, so moving from place to place so often, or on a ship, for example. You've got the confined spaces that are feeding into that. Okay, it's a kind of big toxic, but not a big mix of cocktail of factors. Also, you have change. Under that, I've got, for example, the aging life extension, the kind of creeping change factors, the fact that the creeping change makes it harder because of incremental changes for people to notice changes in the safety integrity of the rig, but that also applies to creeping changes in the well-being of the workforce as well. You've got the reduced manning, of course you've got the technology advances as well. All this needs to be managed. And bottom line to this is that total prevention isn't a complete answer. It needs to be backed up by resilience. So looking at that more specifically, within these next slides, I'm not intending to go through this point by point. I just want to highlight some of the key areas. And what I've tried to do for each of these principles is to put a tick for those kind of things that are already there, that are enablers. You might not all agree with them. For example, people might go into offshore industry originally many years ago on the basis of pay, but of course the conditions, changes in terms of conditions, the uncertainty means that it's no longer acting as an incentive in the same way. In fact, it may be frozen pay might be affecting morale. But however, it's a kind of industry that associated with long periods of time off, that allows people to pursue lifestyle choices that the kind of people in a normal 9-to-5 job on shore might not be able to do. You've got variations in the quality of the facilities, but you've got cleanliness, lots of rigs, you have gyms and so on, which of course will enable, and it's important to make sure that people look after that, people have personal cabins and so on. You have, in terms of comms, you've got robust communication systems already in place. We've got training on human factors, for example, human crew resource management. Worker involvement should, of course, be done, and undoubtedly will be done, to enhance the safety. Regular briefings and the robust safety management and planning systems. Where resilience strategies might help over and above what's already going on is, for example, in heightening situational awareness. So, building in pauses, getting people to deliberately check. This is like drawing on the notion of dynamic risk assessment, but checking not just what the hazards are, not just what the kit is, the robustness of the kit, not just what they get, the feedback they're getting from the well, but from time to time building into the pauses that makes them think, well, how am I feeling? How tired am I? What's on my fatigue level? What am I thinking about? What might get in the way? And do I need to tell anyone? Being very deliberate about having those checks. For example, at the start of a shift, coming back from the break, just to collate yourself and to pause and bring your attention and focus into the important is another way of looking at dynamic risk assessments. Again, I know this happens a lot in offshore industry anyway, but the idea of using fresh pair of eyes, somebody else from another part of the rig, for example, or another part of a shift who's unfamiliar with that area of work, let them come in and notice what's going on, and they might be able to shed new light. Positive experiences, and again, it stands to reason. It's common sense, but it's so often it's a thing that goes when everyone is under pressure. People forget to smile, and it needs to be managed. People shouldn't forget that. Remember, the value of a smile are the fun moments, the banter. Protect that. Be deliberate about it if you have to, especially as a manager. Be deliberate about it. And people, for example, thinking, okay, being mindful themselves as individuals, if they engage too much in the anti-awfulizing, that can have a contagious effect on a negative contagious effect on the morale of their colleagues. So it's why individuals take responsibility for the tone of their conversation. Think being mindful of the knock-on effects. And that's, of course, if they are allowed to sort of talk about their grievances, for example, with their line manager, then they shouldn't necessarily need to rely on the kind of grapevine to vent their feelings. So, but it's taking responsibility and thinking about being deliberately positive, having fun to offset the kind of demand. That's so important. Demands and control, I've already talked about that kind of thing. But of course, and I know the offshore industry is very good at this, but it's monitoring the kind of amount of hours that people have, the breaks in between them, to make sure that there's sufficient recovery time built in, and not letting that go when the pressure is on. And of course, we all know if you give more to control, semi-autonomous working, that will help people, and worker involvement, sense of participation, and sense of contributing to the decisions, that will help people with their morale as well. Looking at the meaningful principle, okay, in this industry is providing. It's not just about wealth. I mean, it's generating wealth, but it's providing a service, of course, that is essential. On which everyone depends. Maybe it's useful to remind people about that from time to time when they're getting bogged down with the daily grind. So it's also things like okay, one of the existing enablers, if you like, is that this kind of lifestyle allows people to pursue like skiing when you're taking time off work and that sort of thing. A lifestyle outside work that, as I was saying earlier on, that not everyone is able to pursue. But it's also, again, when things like bonuses are getting frozen, when there's no longer kind of opportunities for career progression, then don't neglect, stay mindful of the small gestures such as the thank yous, the well dones, a pat on the backs. And that's not just done by the line management, everyone participates in that, and don't underestimate it, because we're not great at doing this generally, but that's so vitally important as people get to hear that informal recognition can make all the difference. Things like reminding people, or making sure people are clear on how they contribute, how they're making a difference to life on the rig, yeah, that they're a valued member of that, how they're contributing to the overall the overall kind of purpose is important too. And at the individual level, things like, if you're feeling like your morale's going, or it's getting a real drag, or it's kind of thinking, well, reminding yourself from time to time, well, if I was to give up this job, what is it that would I lose? It's just to help keep yourself going. There is something about this that I do like, I still like, and I want to keep hold of it. If that is indeed what you want to do. Moving on to the kind of connections. Again, you've got your community. What you're aiming to achieve is a community because you're in a contained area, so it's important that the relationships are, of course, as harmonious as possible. And I know in many rigs there's all sorts of facilities that allow leisure pursuits to be pursued, but here it's finding out balance, because people want their privacy, of course. They want to be able to go into their cabins, but not doing that, being mindful when they're doing that, that it's also important from time to time to go and engage people with other people on a social basis. So providing those opportunities, even when the pressure is on, for people to relax with one another, and having, for example, buddy systems and that sort of thing can help as well. Line management. Evidence is telling us more and more that nowadays it's really important that line managers are able to notice changes in their team. And that's dependent, of course, to be able to do that, they need to know their team well and use those signals that they pick up to be able to adjust their approach. I mean, this is, of course, kind of like resonant line management. Because there'll be some times, for example, when you need to get into command and control style, for example. Other times where coaching style might be more important. Other times of being more visionary and motivational is important. But it's important to be able to notice the changing team dynamics, to work out what's the best tact, that flexibility. Also, avoiding assuming that because you are in a leadership position that you are the total expert. Again, you'll know that from worker involvement, but it's important to keep reminding yourselves, or in this industry, to listen with humility, to lose the hierarchy, so that you stay responsive to those signals, both on the safety front and on the wellbeing front. Right, going on to the learning principles. Now, of course, in this industry, we'll be extremely good at keeping monitoring a whole raft of leading and lagging indicators that allows it to stay in tune with the environment. Be very good at work, and of course worker involvement is very important to enabling that as well. But as I was saying earlier on, it's applying those principles not just to safety, but to the crew, to noticing how they are, by leading and lagging indicators of stress and well-being, conducting kind of well-being stress surveys from time to time, but also on the interpersonal level, noticing those signals that's important. Also, and again, this is a feature of high reliability organisations, the advantage of worker involvement is that it allows you to stay in touch with what's going on. But what can happen in some companies is that there can be a tendency to only really want to listen to what they want to hear, in which case they become isolated from the bad news. And of course, that's the last thing you want in this industry. So that interpersonal skill, that noticing skill, is important for this sector, is particularly important for this sector as well. Big picture. Right, so the big picture principle. Okay, so key kind of, there'll be lots going on that will enable that already, such as the strategic planning, the market analysis, all that will be going on, the planning, be robust planning systems. But again, as I was saying earlier on, the planning is about being mindful of the knock-on effects of decisions, not just in the short term, but in further down the line, the toll it might take on staff. It's also important, for example, to think about, as part of this big picture, is using it as an opportunity for individuals to develop a diverse set of skill sets, so that they stay employable as they can, whether they stay in this industry or whether they work on go and work in another industry. It's also important, for example, as I was saying, for consistency between the walk and the talk and so on. So thinking about big picture, perspective taking, and the consistency between the messages. Fitness, of course, there'll be facilities on rigs, there'll be facilities on ships for people, there'll be gyms and that sort of thing. But still, that goes on. But there's evidence out there around health promotion and then kind of weight gain and how that might be having an impact. So provide the opportunities, be the role models as well, lead by examples. And in terms of sleep hygiene, most people should know this, but whether they do it or not is a different question. But it's being very protective about having things like a regular wind-down routine before going to sleep. Watching TV, small tips like that, watching TV in a chair, for example, so that to really enhance, optimize the quality of sleep that can be obtained even if there's a lot of noise going on. And of course, designing out noise is crucially important here. So in terms of the benefits, so that is, there's much more to this, but hopefully it should be clear that some of these solutions, some of them are more about the systems, like oversight of the communications and so on, but some of them are simple and straightforward, such as a positive banter, looking after that. That's the first thing that's one of the first things that can suffer when we're under stress. And it's being very deliberate about not letting go of that. Those kind of softer touches, for want of a better description, that is crucial to keeping work as comfortable as it can be, and then ensuring, for example, that the workforce stays resilient and stays as well as possible. So just looking more closely at what the benefits are. So I've highlighted here in this slide the kind of how the benefits of managing resilience more effectively in this sector can be unpacked. So of course, there's a reputational aspect of it, there's a sustainability aspect of it that's already been described. There's also the link with safety, in that the less stressed we are, or in fact the more stressed we are, the more distracted we are, the more noise going on in our head, the less able we are to respond to the safety risk within our situation. It can hamper our situational awareness, and that means when we're in that kind of state, we're more likely to go into unsafe behaviour. So resilience, thinking about the resilient stuff, coupled with stress prevention, is key to enabling safety and securing the high reliability of the organisation. Also, for sustainability and reputation point of view, again, we need to, companies generally across the piece, it's almost like it's a moral, legal and business case for this as well, is that we've all got to work until, with the retirement age kind of increasingly being raised, We've got to stay effective and stay productive further into our lifespan. And so we've got to have the quality of life that we experience at work is become more and more important, because we can't wait until, retirement is it's sensitive that retirement necessarily is becoming more of a hypothetical than a reality, perhaps further down the line. And of course, we know those big figures, huge costs associated with sickness absence for society at large. So thinking more innovatively about how to tackle it by thinking about well-being and it not being a pink and fluffy topic. It's fundamental. It needs to be built into the fabric of the organisation. That will help that sustainability argument as well. So that's the benefits. In terms of what can be done about this, I was saying earlier on, work for a company called Tribe, which is about culture change as well. But this is the kind of things that could be done on this kind of area to look at ways of enhancing resilience, making sure it's embedded into the organisation, is through things like strategic gap analysis to compare what's going on, the overall approach, with what the evidence-based approach should be. Secondly, running kind of cultural assessments, and then using a kind of diagnosis that they provide for example, for designing programs that's fit for purpose. Also things that can be done, for example, is getting the leadership of the organisation together to think through this current strategy and making sure it's a very interactive experience and producing action plans at the end of it, along with supervisor training, because as we all know, it's a supervisory level that can sometimes be the bottleneck to taking this kind of stuff forward. So that's the kind of thing that can be done alongside this. This is a growing area, so I would encourage all of you to keep an eye out. A lot of it might sound like common sense, but as I was saying earlier on, common sense is not always common practice, and these are the things that slip with lean management. So it's taking that long view that's all very important. So I think I've come to the end of the actual presentation, so I'm happy to take a few questions.
We have one question for you. Excuse me, from Peter Rees. Peter, thank you for the question. What stress-related leading or lagging KPIs do you feel would be relevant?
It's not relying on any one, because there's subjectivity involved that's important. So of course the conventional way of looking at it, sickness absence as lagging indicators, is things like sickness absence indicators. It's the turnover, it's the morale, it's the kind of quality of people that you're attracting into the organisation from a reputational point of view on the lagging side. On the leading side, it's running stress. For example, you have a management stance, you have a stress indicator tool. It's running well-being surveys. There's a number of them out there. But looking at those, looking at your leading indicators and your lagging indicators alongside your conventional safety indicators will give you a picture of a knock-on effects or how stress and well-being is interacting with safety. And if you're also doing it alongside the productivity indicators, then you got a much more holistic understanding of what is that's impacting upon your rigs or your ship's kind of overall kind of success.
Okay, thank you for that. But you mentioned surveys in that, Jenny. I guess the question, in your experience, how do you find that people, when asked at focusing on stress, they're able to be honest, able and willing to be honest in answering these surveys, or is it something that needs to be introduced and sort of reinforced as you do it to make people comfortable?
Right, so as with any survey, if you want an honest picture of what's going on, you need to anonymize it, and people need to be confident that they need to be confident that there's not going to be revelation of personal identifiable information. It's going to be user integrity, and also that you feed back on it. You do something with that evidence. You just don't conduct a survey and assessment and then not do anything else. You follow it up with action and you feedback how it's going to be used, and then you reinforce people's commitment and belief that their opinion and their well-being matters.
Okay, Jane, thank you for that. Our next question is from Neil Murray. Again, Neil, thank you for your question. How much impact does diet have offshore?
Well, I don't think it's any different than anywhere else. Diet is crucially important. So I know in offshore facilities, there'll be canteens that provide healthy food options. It's making sure that they use it as well. That's important as well, and reinforcing that. So making sure that the healthy food option, it's using ideas like nudge. It's the most obvious things that's available. It's like other people, leadership, so on. Everyone role modeling eating healthy food, but as part of that fitness thing, stands to reason. Fitness is also influenced by what we eat.
Thank you for that. Next question from Catherine. Catherine, I just asked a question about pulse interviews.
What I mean by pulse interviews is that sometimes you can get a barometer of what's really going on in a short kind of survey, 12 items, maybe using a selection of the items you've got in your main survey to get a kind of more immediate understanding of the kind of how things are at that time without doing a huge extensive 30-item questionnaire. So sometimes just having that pulse surveys and pulse interviews with people, backing up the formal measurement with the discussion with people, focus groups as well. Yeah. So you've got the qualitative information coupled with the kind of more objective information that you get from slightly more objective information that you get from surveys and your lagging indicators. That gives you a proper understanding what's going on. Now, pulse interviews, you can do pulse focus groups as well. And when you do those, it's important that you select a fairly different cohorts of your crew, for example, so that you get an accurate picture of what's going on. But with qualitative, it's also important to bear in mind you're not necessarily looking for asking loads of people, because you're trying to drill down into the explanations with it of what's going on. It tells you the why, the survey tells you the what.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question from Lance. Are there any case studies available to view that show improvement?
I've looked for case studies, and to be honest, in this sector, there's not a lot for this sector that's out there at the moment. You can look at case studies in other sectors. For example, on DWP's website, there's all sorts of case studies on there about wellbeing interventions in a variety of sectors. In British Innovation Technology, there's case studies on there. More and more case studies are developing, but I would say in this sector, given the stresses that the workforce is under, if any of you want to go forward and take this area forward, I think that would help share the learning on this to really make sure that the solutions are taken into account the kind of stresses that define working offshore. So go ahead. If you, I'd encourage this to all be taken forward. Of course, I'm going to say that but it needs to be. The field of resilience and well-being generally needs to be taken forward.
Okay, no, I think you've got a really good point there, Jen. I think a lot of the things you talked today, although you're talking about the context of offshore today, apply to other industries and vice versa. So strategies taken elsewhere, made elsewhere, could be applied to us.
There's a reference section at the end of this presentation. There's lots of research on there on understanding what the stresses are. Okay, but again, it needs to be moved more into actual interventions.
Next question came from Paul. Offshore is more than oil and gas, and you're absolutely right. I think we made a point of talking about the marine sector, the ships, and obviously offshore as well. But where is the HSE with controls for other trades? So with regards to resilience, where is the HSE with identifying controls in other trades, or just generally how is the
with HSE's main tack on well-being is via the management standards. That is its stock and trade approach for tackling well-being, because it's focusing in HSE's interest. It's to focus on prevention side of it as well. So management standards. But what I'm saying with this presentation is that it's necessary. Preventing stresses is necessary, but it's not totally sufficient. You need to do this resilience side of it as well for the day.
The next question from Kevin, and I think it touches on a point that everybody who's attending, certainly from the offshore industry, will relate to. So thank you for your question, Kevin. Currently, the main stress factor I'm encountering is job security, and management cannot give any advice or reassurance on job security. It is a difficult time for the industry. So how can you manage these emotions to help workers have a more positive outlook?
Right, so again, that's taking on the resilience, that's responding to change. So it's keeping them involved, keep communicating with them. It will be hard. I mean, initially it's understanding that they're going to go through a tough time without accepting that. But over time, as they adjust to it, it's getting them to think through sort of, are there opportunities in it? Is there, for example, a silver lining in it for them? How does that change sit, for example, within their plans for their life course? Does it represent another opportunity now to find another way of achieving an effective working life through into their 80s? So it's taking a kind of life course view on it that's important as well. Keeping them communicated. Line managers noticing the signals, keep talking to them, and of course in those kind of conditions as well, it's important that the managers support one another as well, because they're uniquely dealing with that situation with their team. So those support principles apply to all layers. And of course you'll have your HR hopefully will be providing people advice on what is happening and what other kind of career opportunities or that sort of thing. But there should be HR should be helping out with this sort of thing as well. It's almost like another kind of massive presentation in its own right. But taking that life course view as part of resilience, I would say, is important.
Next question is from Dawn, and a really good question, I think. Do you have any advice re-referring stress personnel for counselling versus self-referral?
Well, you need to have both. People need to be able to self-refer, because they might not always want their management to know that they're struggling in any way, and they need to be able to access or understand what their options are. Of course, the ideal situation is that they can talk to their line managers about this as well. If they can't talk to their line managers, there's someone else they can go and talk to in the organisation as well. But yeah, I'd say you need to have both.
Thank you for that. I'm going to read this next question from Peter. Should other factors such as news subjects, such as helicopter safety after incidents, reported in the press, and then questions asked by family members, have these additional stresses been quantified?
Quantified. Stress is subjective. Okay, so yeah, you could conduct a survey to quantify it. I cannot say there's been a survey to quantify the impact of those, but intuitively and from the qualitative work, and because it varies from individual to individual, that is, of course, it's going to have an adverse impact. And it's another thing to take into account into having this kind of holistic approach to managing people's well-being and resilience generally. Yeah.
I guess with that kind of thing, again, what you talked about with regards to being engaged with the workforce and open lines of communication.
If you already have conditions in place, if you already have an environment where you've got these close connections, the support there anyway, you're going to be able to soak up this stuff more effectively. People will find it easier to recover in a more adaptive way. If you've got that flexibility, for example, that allows people to kind of step out for a while, or if they choose to keep going, but you will need to be mindful of the impact of that and safety. But if you've got these conditions in place, the whole point of resilience is that you can soak this stuff up as you go along.
Okay, very good. Question from Peter Rees this time. Is there any evidence to suggest that employee assistance programs actually work and aid in reducing stress or increasing resilience?
Employee assistance programs is a tertiary intervention, so it's very much more of a reactive program. And okay, I cannot say that there's been a wholesale survey looking at the effectiveness of them. I think that would need to be looked at on a case-by-case, organisation-by-organisation basis. But that in itself needs to be coupled, because it's a reactive thing. That needs to be coupled with a kind of more preventative stance as well, to make sure people, okay, they can use that if they need to, but they can use other sources. They can go to their line managers as well. They don't have to depend on those kind of services.
I guess it's almost like the first aid kit for stress, where actually what you want to do is prevent that happening.
If you can, prevent, ideally, and then accommodate as well. Some people start. So that's the ideal. Is to struggle, but to have all of it. So yeah, I don't think there's any evidence saying that EAP, because it would vary on a case by case basis.
Okay, very good. Okay, that's the last question that we have on the system. If anybody wants to raise one now, please do so as we're approaching the end, but we probably have time for others. But while I allow you to write one, if you go into what I'll say to those who already have asked the question, thank you very much for doing so. A really good range of questions, and obviously the audio of this presentation will be available online, so you'll be able to access that after the fact. So if there was anything you missed or didn't quite catch, you'll hopefully be able to get that for yourself next time.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Jenny and also to Simon as well. As Simon mentioned, we will be putting a copy of this recording out onto the Offshore Group microsite. We will also be providing a PDF version of the presentation to go with that, so you will be able to download that separately and also listen to anything that you may have missed during the session. Again, thank you to both for coming in, and particularly thank you to Jenny for speaking. Thank you all for attending, and we hope that you all found it very enjoyable and informative. I'm going to leave the chat box open for just another sort of minute or two, just for any final comments you might have or any final questions you may have. Otherwise, thank you all for attending, and goodbye.